I'm Teresa Carraggio, and this is Third Paradigm. I'm going to be talking today about Russell Brand and the Illuminati. Since I put out my episode on Russell Branded, I've had different commenters who said, you need to watch this video because we think you're being naive about Russell Brand. And one of those videos was a Larry King interview. And then another was called The Downfall of Russell Brand, looking at Israel and Palestine. And then the third one was, Can We Trust Russell Brand? And that was by someone called Deep Thought. And I will admit that I found it disturbing enough that it gave me nightmares. So then I watched it again today and watched more of Russell responding to something. And I want to put that all together today and put my thoughts out, pro and con, so that you can look at the evidence for yourself. Let's do this. The first video is the interview by Larry King, and it's just after Russell has married Katy Perry. So quite a while ago, I'm thinking that was 2010. And in this video, Russell talks about his former life and how, yes, he was always looking for the right one. And so sometimes he would be auditioning 3 or 4 at a time in order to find the right one. And now that he has found the right one, that's no longer a part of him. So I found him hilarious, even though it's a side of Russell that I don't see, because I started listening to him going back to 2017, and I never saw the early Russell. But the person who has is my dance teacher, and his movies of Get Him to the Greek are one of her favorite things. And Gina is Russell at his most outrageous in a female form. She dresses like a boy and she's very athletic, but the things that she can do are so amazing. And I look at the class as women taking power from their own sexuality. And we write her up all the time for sexual harassment of men, women, inanimate objects, dogs, and particularly herself. She is someone who just is always playing and always pushing the envelope a little bit more, and it is catching. And so it's attracted people so that we have sexually inappropriate Wednesdays. Today there was a little 3-year-old girl who was outside the window with her mom with this unruly mop of hair, and she was fascinated, and she watched for one dance, and then we lured her and her mother to come in, and she was in the back of the class, and her dancing was the most adorable thing I have ever seen. There is something about that expression. Being sexy is funny. It is not supposed to be serious. Other than defecating, sex is probably the most undignified thing we ever do. And so playing with it and being able to just make fun of yourself is something that I do not want to lose. I don't want to have to take sex seriously. So I think that this attack on Russell and trying to make it as if sex is something that we need to go back to being Puritans about is ridiculous. That is something that is just not going to offend me. The second video is done by someone who calls himself the Kavernacle, and he did The Downfall of Russell Brand, the selling out of Palestine. So he begins by showing Russell Brand when he was doing the truths and how way back in 2009, when no one was really talking out about Palestine, Russell was. And he shows the things that Russell was saying back then that were seriously edgy. I remember I had a radio show, Third Paradigm, on the pirate station in 2010, and that was during the assault on Gaza. And I was doing episodes called Friends Don't Let Friends Condone Genocide. I was cornering every Jewish friend that I had. I was calling them on the phone, I was talking to them in the playground, and I was saying, how do you feel about this? Are you okay about this? Do you know what's happening? And I remember men like jumping in between me and the woman and saying, you get over there, you stop harassing her. So that's how unpopular it was. I remember my neighbor who teaches history at the university or geography and saying, why is it that Palestine isn't even a country? Because my kids in high school had to memorize the capitals of every country in the world except Palestine, because Palestine didn't exist. This is how far we've come. And the point that Kavernacle makes is that now in 2021, when he made that, it was much more acceptable to be expressing criticism of Israel. And yet Russell seems to be much more neutral about that. And what Russell actually says in the clips that he shows is, I feel like I don't have anything new to add to this. I've already said how I feel, and I think that this is really for other people to be saying, what's our solution here and how do we deal with this? And he's critiqued by Kavernacle for only bringing on Gabor Mate. And the only way that he seems to know who Gabor Mate is Aaron Mate's dad. So he's not familiar. He says, yeah, Russell seems to have interviewed him before and, seems to know him. And that Gabor talks about how he had been a Zionist, and that when he went with a humanitarian group to Gaza in order to provide medical and psychological services, that he cried for 2 weeks. Every day he cried, and that he had to look at him being a Zionist back then in his youth and how wrong that was. And Russell, I remember in the next day's video said, I have to change my point of view, that when Gabor says this, it's not just two sides of the same thing. And he went back to what he was saying in 2009, that when you have that disparity of power, that you can't just look at it as these are two sides of a war when one side has rocks and the other one has missiles. So Kavernacle looks at Russell as being a grifter and says, yes, he used to talk about serious things, but now he talks about stupid things like the vaccine and about masks. And he even did this whole thing on the trucker convoy. And that was obviously just in order to get viewers, because he's gone right wing instead of being a good, true leftist like he used to be. So I think that with my audience, I don't need to really say much more in order to discredit that point of view. But he also talks about Russell interviewing David Icke and saying, yeah, this is an obvious conspiracy theorist. And what Russell says in the interview is, you say all these things that I really agree with, and then you talk about these things, and it seems like these things kind of discredit those things. And David Icke does a very interesting, it gets very funny because they're talking about reptiles. And of course, Russell was trying to figure out if he's a reptile. And so I think that that whole point of view made me actually like Russell even more. Now let's look at Can We Trust Russell Brand, which was done by Deep Thought 8 years ago. And this is the one that I found the most disturbing. it goes through 6 different pieces of evidence that I'm going to bring up that show that, according to deep thought, that Russell Brand is a part or controlled by the Illuminati. The first thing is the most obvious, which is that he has a very evident tattoo of 33 on his wrist. And I'll mention what he says about that later, but that is the level of Freemasons at which these pedosadist cults exist. And I, after doing my episodes on Annika Lucas, on my neighbor's daughter, on Whitney Webb, I have no question at all that this is what runs our world and controls everything. And that if you are a celebrity or a politician in that, if we know your name, you're not one of the players. You are one of the ones being played. That when Annika Lucas was being interviewed by a woman this time, which I really thought was refreshing, the woman said 95% of the people who are in these cults want to get out, but they can't. They feel trapped. And so I think it's those 95% that we need to be paying attention to and providing that way out. So here are other things that were pointed out in there. So Russell came out with a book, a children's book on the Pied Piper of Hamelin, where he reinterprets that. And the Pied Piper is a dark tale. It's a tale where the piper gets all the rats out of the town of Hamelin with his magical little flute, but then they don't pay him. And so he lures all the children. And so all the children go out and follow him into the forest and into the caves, which I think is especially ominous with the things that we know these days about Maui and Lahaina and Oprah's property and the caves that supposedly are under there. So I don't take any of these things lightly. They talk about how the black and white checks on the costumes are related to the Illuminati's floor, that they always have black and white checks, and that there's a correspondence to Russell's face with, that he talks about the Pied Piper being like him. And in it, there's also a reference that he makes to, their costumes, they're kind of like Clockwork Orange. And again, a very ominous kind of reference for a children's book. The next reference is to an appearance that he did at the Olympics, where he was on the top of this bus with all these other characters that were captive in it, and that the character that he seems to be playing is like the child snatcher from a Disney film. I'm trying to remember which one, but maybe a Roald Dahl, I don't know. But so looking at him as the child snatcher is another reference, according to deep thought, to these pedosadist cult, in my words, or Illuminati in his, and that's the role that Russell is playing to lure children and trap them into these other, this occult kind of thinking. And then he looks at the marriage to Katy Perry. And there's an interview it plays of Katy Perry where she's talking about, this wasn't what I expected. I grew up singing gospel. Both of my parents are traveling ministers. And so at 15, I came out with this gospel album and it didn't really go anywhere. And so I sold my soul to the devil. So that is something that then is backed up by a lot of different footage and images where very clearly Katy Perry's costumes, the sets, the staging has references to the eye, to the snakes, to the pyramid. There are very, very obvious references that are in there. And then it also talks about how Madonna gave her push. And that is another reference to someone who is quite likely in that world. It was also interesting to find out that when Russell divorced her, I learned from Wikipedia, that he could have taken half of the money that she made in the 14 months that they were married, which was 44 million. 44 million in 14 months. But he chose not to. So that is another reference that's looked at. And then there's a scene of Russell and Katy Perry at the Oscars. And they come out and they're talking to a reporter. And Russell has this thing that he's fiddling with. And then Katy sees him fiddling with it. You know, her demeanor seems to change a little. And then he's holding it. And you see him posing for a picture later with it, with the two of them. And it has the little 5-pointed star and says, obey. That was very chilling to me because it was hard to see what function that served, and it is very prominently displayed. And then the last one is where he is on some talk show. It's a woman named Lorraine who I think does a daytime morning show, and he is making a joke about how he really wants children, and he wants them so much that he hijacks his friends' children. And so there's 2 children that come out, and it's maybe a 5-year-old girl and a 2-year-old boy, and they sit on his lap, and he has his arms around them, and he answers some different questions. And what you see, because Deep Thought definitely plays this several times and slows it down to make sure you don't miss it, is that his arm is around the little girl and his hand is on her chest. And that what Deep Thought is saying is that as he's diverting your attention to the little boy, that his hand moves up and down, not in a, I don't know whether it's a sinister way or not. And then you see the girl elbow his hand out of the way. So that, again, was something that I really feel like I need to look at. There's also a reference where he says, and yeah, how can you reconcile this with someone who's so spiritual? And he shows a picture of Russell and the Dalai Lama. And I think that's a tell, because these days we would all be looking at the Dalai Lama very differently than we would have 8 years ago. Deep Thought also looks at the movie scripts that Russell has been part of and their promotion of very young girls in a way that is extremely sexual. So here's the first thing that I would say. There's a difference between being an Illuminati member and being an Illuminati asset. Those who are in films or in the music industry are not writing the scripts. They're not staging them. They're not designing the costumes. It's someone else who's doing that. And there is no question in my mind that Hollywood is perhaps the hub, along with the city of London, of this whole pedo-sadist cult. And when you look at Russell in that role of the child snatcher, but you realize that child snatcher actually comes from a Disney film, it's hard to say that Russell is the one who's designing that he's the one who's instigating this idea of who he is, or is someone else using him in that role? I think that that seems very likely for, according to some of my friends, they think everyone in Hollywood is being controlled in that way. I look at Katy Perry and the way in which she's been used, and there is no question that that is the script that she has been cast, and that's why she's being making that 44 million in 14 months, is that she is playing this role, and there is a definite purpose that is sinister about that role. It's not just about some enjoyment of female sexuality. There is definitely a dark message that is coming across in those. And when I look at that Oscar appearance, something feels very wrong about it. There's just this gut level that I have of like, there is something I don't know that's going on. Russell looks miserable and just uncomfortable. I remember him talking about being in Hollywood and living in this huge house and how uncomfortable that made him, that he just wanted to like find some little tiny corner and live out of that, because that grand house just felt so wrong to him and so big and empty and lonely. So I wonder whether there was something that was going on in which he was being used, and where with that sudden divorce, where he sends Katy Perry a text message on New Year's Eve telling her that he's divorcing her, I wonder whether that was how he needed to just walk away. And that cut, I believe maybe that is the reason for all of this. Maybe it is about all the things he's talking about that they don't want him to. Certainly that's true. But I also wonder if this is payback for the fact that he walked away. To end, I'll link the video where Russell talks about his tattoos, because I can't do it justice. But watching this again made me remember that that's the Russell that I know. And he says, well, if I were Illuminati, what exactly would it be serving them for me to be saying things like, I can't tell you what to think. You need to think for yourself. And you shouldn't be following me. And we all need to be looking at what the solutions are to these problems. But I think we should decentralize so that no one can seize power over all of us. That makes a lot of sense to me. So here is the one that Russell did on his tattoos, as he calls them. And this is one I did in response to that, wearing my cheetah spot tattoos for Halloween, called Inner Being versus Interdependence. Thank you for watching.